Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Okay, happy Thursday everybody. First up for today, we have some developments in China's banking sector. Before we move on to this, however, we note a quick economic update. The official Manufacturing Purchasing Managers Index, published by the National Bureau of Statistics today, Thursday, unexpectedly fell slightly to 49.4 in November from 49.5 in October. A PMI reading above 50 indicates expansion in activity, while a reading below that level demonstrates a contraction. If these official data are accurate, then China's factory activity has shrank for a second month in November, while non-manufacturing activity hit yet another new low for the year, signaling that despite all the fiscal policy support, the economy is still very much not out of the woods. Okay, now to banking. According to data from the official China Electronic Local Government Bond Market Access, local governments in China have sold record amounts of so-called special bonds this year in order to inject capital into struggling smaller banks. Special purpose bonds are a form of extra budgetary debt financing used by local governments in China, with the proceeds raised typically earmarked for specific policy goals like infrastructure projects, but in this case supporting squeezed small local banks. The trend highlights how more and more of the country's smaller banks are being propped up with government support. UK-based Reuters, writing on the data, reports that local governments plan to use the proceeds of the latest bond sales to purchase equity or convertible bonds from smaller banks, most of them state-owned, effectively recapitalizing them. Quote, the governments have raised 152.3 billion yuan, 21.05 billion US dollars, via such bonds so far in 2023 to replenish the capital of small and medium-sized banks. But total funds raised so far are modest compared to the bank's needs, analysts say. End quote. According to an October report by S&P Global Ratings, China's small regional banks would need to address a capital shortfall of an estimated 2.2 trillion yuan based on a scenario where up to 20% of regional lenders face capital inadequacy. The Reuters piece continues, quote, the issuance of fresh debt by the local governments to recapitalize banks coming at a time when their own liabilities are growing rapidly could make the Financial Balancing Act for municipalities even more precarious. On top of 21 billion raised so far this year, the Henan provincial government last week announced a plan to issue 28.2 billion yuan worth of special purpose bonds to recapitalize 26 local banks. End quote. And the support is crucial. Quote, it is important to avoid any failures of even the smallest institutions, as a single failure could generate knock-on effects and spread financial contagion to other financial institutions. End quote. Analysts agree that smaller regional banks are the weak link in China's $61 trillion financial sector. Quote, due to their industrial, sectorial, and geographical concentration, opaque governance, and lack of stringent regulatory oversight. End quote. In the words of one analyst. There are issues with the big banks too, however. China's financial media outlet Caixin this week has published several reports on the expanding corruption mess at Industrial and Commercial Bank of China, the largest bank in the world by assets. For our purposes, we don't need to go into the weeds regarding this investigation, we just take note of the salient details. In a piece titled Multiple Former ICBC Executives Under Corruption Probe, Caixin writes this week that since China Renaissance Holdings Limited president Cong Lin was taken away by the authorities for investigation in September 2022, an increasing number of people at his former employer, Industrial and Commercial Bank of China, have come under probes. The outlet learned from sources that Cong's predecessor, Huang Mingxiang, was recently out of contact and is likely under investigation too. A person close to the bank said that Huang, former chairman and CEO of ICBC International, had close ties with Zhang Hongli, former senior executive vice president of the bank, who was placed under investigation for suspected severe violations of law earlier this month. Huang's predecessor, Li Xiaopeng, was also probed in April. Quote, The CCDI was not joking when it said in January that we will focus on key areas and deepen the crackdown on corruption in areas with concentrated power, capital and resources, such as finance. End quote. Now, one more update while we're on the banking sector. In an exclusive report from US-based Bloomberg, one of China's largest investment banks, China International Capital Corp, has warned its analysts against making any bearish calls on the economy. The outlet writes that analysts are barred from sharing negative comments about the economy or markets in both public and private discussions, according to an internal memo seen by the outlet. Employees should also avoid wearing luxury brands or revealing their compensation to third parties, according to the memo. Quote, the directive underscores the increasing level of self-scrutiny at Chinese financial institutions after authorities lashed out this year at bankers' hedonistic lifestyles and ordered them to comply with Xi Jinping's common prosperity drive. It also highlights concern among international investors that China is increasingly restricting access to transparent data and research in the world's second largest economy. End quote. Hey everyone, if you're getting some value from today's episode, I have a huge favor to ask. If you're not subscribed already, it's a big help if you subscribe and hit that bell notification and hit the like button. This is the primary way in which the channel can grow. It helps with the algorithm. If the channel can grow, it means I can put more resources into it and hopefully provide a better experience for you all going forward. And for anyone who wants to help keep the channel financially sustainable, keep the channel primarily subscriber supported, Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below. Thank you so much everybody for all the support for the channel. For the second half of today's video, I wanted to examine several commentaries from the Chinese side on the current state of China-US relations since the Biden-Xi meeting. Once again, the reason we do this is to get a grasp on how US policy specifically and foreign policy generally is being discussed and debated within Beijing's elite circles. The consensus among international voices on all of this is that China is seeking some sort of short-term stabilization in US-China relations in order to give it much-needed space to focus on serious economic issues at home. We've already covered a lot of state media commentaries on the Chinese side, so to spare regular viewers from listening to the same points again, today we will focus on discussions among prominent scholars, academics, and advisors to the government. Li Cheng at the University of Hong Kong and former director of the Brookings Institute's John L. Thornton China Center expressed on the Biden-Xi meeting, quote, has the US-China relationship reached a turning point? My answer is no, end quote, calling the meeting a thaw or stabilization, but not a major improvement. Wang Jisi is founding president of the Institute of International and Strategic Studies at China's prestigious Peking University. Full disclosure, he was also one of my professors when I did my master's degree there. In an opinion piece in Foreign Affairs, Wang argues, quote, influential citizens in both countries must mobilize to find ways beyond official engagement to promote the common good. Whatever new paradigm leaders in Beijing and Washington choose must do more than just avoid a new Cold War. It must prevent a hot one as well. End quote. Wu Xinbo, director of Fudan University's Institute for International Studies and an authoritative voice on US-China relations, writes that improving relations with Washington should help stabilize China's slowing economy by boosting market confidence and attracting much-needed foreign investment. Diplomatically, he argues that the current détente should alleviate some of the pressures faced by China internationally. Jia Qingguo, the director of Peking University's Institute for Global Cooperation and Understanding and a longtime foreign policy advisor to the government, this week said that the next US election is one of the most uncertain in recent history and fears that it could become a contest of who can be tougher on China. Wang Wen, director of Renmin University's Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies and former state-run Global Times journalist, if journalist is the right term to use, argues for more people-to-people exchanges, saying, quote, more Chinese people should be allowed to have unimpeded contacts with Americans, and more US citizens should be allowed to enter China. In this regard, it is becoming more and more urgent to reform our foreign affairs approval system at all levels so as to facilitate people-to-people and cultural exchanges between China and the United States. End quote. Interestingly, this same Wang was also recently asked a question from a journalist from a popular news site in China, guangcha.cn. This question is very telling, as it touches on the feeling of whiplash felt by some from the former anti-US media coverage in China suddenly changing to the more conciliatory message after the Xi-Biden meeting. This is the question from the Chinese reporter to Wang. Quote, "When US-China relations take a turn for the better, an awkward shift will occur in the trend of opinion conveyed by our media, giving people the sense that such propaganda," we could also translate this as narratives, "has no certainty. How do you think we should handle the relationship between China's US-friendly and hardline voices? How can we maintain a public opinion buffer zone with regard to the US and avoid the impact of sharp shifts in opinion on the credibility of our own media and scholars?" End quote. And finally, Professor Da Wei, director of the Center for International Security, is a respected voice in Beijing. Before the Biden meeting, Da had expressed that China was angry and disappointed when it realized that the Biden administration was bent on maintaining former President Donald Trump's get tough policies. But Chinese officials came to accept that America was not going to change its fundamental strategy. Quote, "This sense of realism has led to an interesting new equilibrium. Even if China cannot formally accept America's framework of a strategic competition with guardrails, the two sides' understanding of bilateral relations is much closer than it was 2 years ago." End quote. Then on Tuesday of this week, Professor Da published an opinion piece on Chinese news site thepaper.cn describing a potential new normal for US-China relations in the wake of the Xi-Biden meeting. In the piece, he argues that, quote, "The level of concern and dedication to China-US competition and its impact appeared to be noticeably better in China compared with the United States. China, as the weakest side of the game, should be aware of the risk of over-securitization," end quote. What he means by this is the excessive identification of issues as national security threats. He says that in the strategic competition of major powers, if the degree of securitization is too high, it tends to excessively lean towards security over development, leading to a lack of social vitality and innovation capacity. From the experience of major power competition in the 20th century, he says, it is difficult for a major power to be directly defeated by another in competition, but internal strategic changes due to external pressure can pose a greater threat to the major power. Da is obviously here referring to the competition between the United States and the Soviet Union and how the latter's over-focus on national security and subsequent crackdown on internal dynamics retarded vitality within the Soviet Union itself, thus greatly and ultimately terminally impeding its ability to compete with the United States. Professor Da in his article then walks a careful political tightrope as he makes the next point. Quote, "Currently, China faces severe external pressure, but ultimately what determines China's development prospects is ourselves, not external forces. As long as we maintain stable development, the strategic suppression and competition from the United States will not achieve their goals." End quote. He is making the unpopular and politically incorrect argument that China's problems are not due to external actors, but primarily due to internal policy missteps. He also criticizes China's infamously myopic view of the world, as one being made up of China and the US ruled everyone else. Quote, "An excessively high degree of securitization may also lead us to overly focus on the United States in our foreign relations. The United States is certainly the country with the greatest impact on China in the world, but the world is rich and diverse, and the United States is not equivalent to the world. In determining our attitude and relations towards third parties, we should not draw lines based on the United States, not opposing what the US supports or supporting what the US opposes. At the same time, the agency of third parties should also be given sufficient respect and attention." End quote. This is certainly good advice. It's unclear, however, whether Beijing's elite will take it on board or not. We give the final word for today's video to my former professor, Wang Jisi, in his Foreign Affairs piece. Quote, The Biden-Xi meeting has put the two countries on a less threatening trajectory in the short term, but one meeting alone cannot halt the long-term momentum in the direction of conflict. End quote. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much everybody for watching. Have a good Thursday, and I will see you all tomorrow.